As the Australian dollar today dropped to its lowest level since 2009, as the share market crashed again, and as oil prices plunged to 30-year lows, the threat from the coronavirus crisis changed shape. If the virus doesn't get you, it seems the economic fallout will. The awful realisation of the extent of the day-to-day disruption to average lives this crisis will cause has hit home in recent days. This is not just a financial shock that affects the share market and investors. It's already hit the tourism and education sectors, but it's going to require lots of people to stay away from work across the economy. A lot of institutions and public places will be closed, and that's going to mean businesses and individuals losing a lot of income.
This is a very different economic shock to the global financial crisis.
Andrew Charlton was Senior Economic Advisor to Kevin Rudd during the GFC, so saw the last crisis from the inside.
Alright, so you're probably wondering what a GFC is, so let's break it down. A GFC is a global financial crisis. This occurred around 2007, and we didn't feel the real impacts of it, or the final impacts, until about 2009. The GFC occurred because our banks were being a bit too greedy. So banks are just like any other business. Their aim is to make as much profit as possible, and this is where the problem occurs. Normally what happens is when people put their money in a savings account, the banks use that money to lend out to other people in order to make money off the money that they have in the system. For example, if you put $100 in savings into a bank, they will lend out about 80% of that cash. So $80 of that $100 they'll lend out to someone else and charge them a higher interest rate. So yes, banks lend out your money in order to earn money off it. And normally in the general situation, not everyone takes out their savings all at the same time. So there's enough cash in their accounts, that 20% cash they hold in reserves, to give out to the people who might withdraw bits and pieces here and there to settle their day-to-day transactions. But in 2007, something disastrous happened in the banking sector of America. There was a whole heap of people defaulting on their loans. Defaulting means that they couldn't afford to repay back the money they borrowed. So what normally happens when people can't repay their loans is the banks will repossess the item that was purchased on the loan, then sell off that item to recover any money that's owed to them. So yeah, in a perfect system, the banks get back what they're owed and they continue doing business like nothing ever happened. So during this period of time, house prices in America were exploding. They were growing at an exponential rate, meaning that if you bought it today, next year you could sell it for a profit. So this was the mentality of many Americans. They were thinking that housing was like the easiest way to make money. Buy it now, always sell it in the future, guaranteed to make a profit. Now banks believe this also, and this is where the problem starts to take place. Banks started becoming very reckless in lending out money to people who they knew couldn't afford to repay the loans. But they gave it to them anyway because they knew that if they defaulted on the loan or couldn't afford to repay it, when it came time to repossessing the asset or the house, they could sell it for a higher profit than what the original loan was worth and still make money off the negative situation. So in the bank's eyes, it was just a win-win situation. They would win if people could afford to repay the loan. They would win if people couldn't afford to repay it and they repossessed the property. So as more people jumped onto the bandwagon of buying property and they couldn't afford to repay it, more people started to default in their loans. Banks started repossessing houses at a high rate. And now we had a problem where there was too many houses for sale and no one was buying it. So normally what happens when there's too much products available and no one wants to buy it, the only way you could get rid of it is by discounting the product till someone's more willing to accept the product. We see this in action in every single market. For example, with clothing. During the end of summer, we always see massive discounts on the summer range of clothing because they want to get rid of the stock so they can restock their shelves full of winter products to make a profit during the winter period. Now going back to banks, what ended up happening is they had a whole heap of houses for sale and no one was buying it. So they had to discount the price and sell them at a loss, meaning that the original value of the loan was not recovered by the sale of the house. So banks were losing money, essentially. So sometime in the future, you decide to do your groceries, you got it all loaded up in your trolley, you go to pay for it, and then you realize that your debit card has been declined. And you're thinking to yourself, that's weird. I should have about $500 in here. Why is this $100 transaction being declined? So now imagine this happening across the nation for every single transaction that was occurring. People who were meant to have money in their bank accounts all of a sudden were being declined for these transactions. This caused mass hysteria and panic amongst the people. So they ended up rushing their banks and trying to withdraw as much money as possible before the banks actually ran out of money. And this is how the whole banking sector ended up collapsing, because they lent out more money than they had available, and when people came to withdraw it, it wasn't there. And following the rules of economics, when people don't spend, businesses don't make money. If businesses don't make money, they start reducing hours for workers or even firing some people in order to still make a profit. At the same time, they don't pay as much taxes, so the government has less money available to make essential services that society needs. So the whole economic chain was destroyed because of the banking sector in America. And this was felt across the globe. So our mate here, Kevin Rudd, had to find a way to keep the economic cycle running in Australia without feeling the negative impacts that the rest of the world was experiencing. He understood there was two big issues that caused the economic shock to occur. One, people lost trust in the banking system. No one was willing to put their savings into a bank because they felt like their money would be lost forever. And two, people weren't spending because they weren't even sure if they're going to have a job in the future, resulting in businesses losing profits and the whole economic chain collapsing on itself, as we were speaking about earlier. So to resolve the banking mistrust, Kevin Rudd guaranteed that if a bank went bust, that the government will bail them out and give all the money to the people who actually were owed money. Thankfully, this never occurred, but you could see that having some trust or confidence in the system was more than enough to keep our economy thriving. So to solve the second problem, Kevin Rudd introduced a $900 stimulus package. Here are the details on the screen for you right now. So it was incredible. Every working Australian who were within those thresholds were receiving some form of cash in their bank account. So yeah, that's how Kevin Rudd kept up our economic prosperity engine, and we were one of only 2 countries to come out of the GFC in a better situation.
The GFC was what economists call a demand shock, which is where consumers are overcome by a wave of fear and shut their wallets. The coronavirus is what economists call a supply shock. It's caused by businesses not having goods and services to sell, and that requires a very different policy response.
So now you understand that the GFC occurred because people weren't willing to spend money, or they had their ability to spend money severely restricted. But what makes the COVID-19 economic shock so much more different from the GFC is the fact that it's impacting our ability to make products rather than our ability to purchase the products. Because of 14-day self-isolation and lockdown procedures introduced in each country, businesses haven't been able to get people in to manufacture products that are required by society. And as a result, we've seen a reduction of goods and services available for everyone. So you already know how reliant we are on China in order to receive some of the products that we consume here in Australia. Now, by having China into lockdown first, we started to experience shortages on the most randomest products out there that really impacted our ability to provide final goods and services here in Australia. For example, with Arnott's biscuits, I know the biscuits are made and produced locally, but the problem is the packaging used to seal those biscuits and have them ready for the shops all came from China. So we experienced a shortage of packaging, which impacted our ability to supply biscuits to Australians. Another example is artificial sweeteners. They all come from China. So Coca-Cola struggled to make Coke No Sugar at the same quantities that they normally produced.
Until now, the government's main focus has been on dealing with the health aspects of this crisis, containing the spread of the virus as long as possible. Its message on the economy has tried to be a reassuring one, that this is not a crisis like the GFC.
This is a very different situation to what we saw through the GFC, which was essentially a problem with the banking and the financial system and issues of liquidity.
Liquidity is just a fancy way of saying they did not have enough money to cover their day-to-day transactions.
This is a health crisis with a significant economic impact.
The discussion about a stimulus package in recent weeks was long conducted inside the well-worn coalition critique of how Labor had dealt with the global financial crisis. The political and ideological constraints seem to have loosened in recent days as the Prime Minister, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg and Treasury officials have raced to put together some sort of response to the growing threat the virus poses to the economy. A bit like the virus itself, though, the extent of that threat seems to be morphing by the day.
In this crisis, the government needs to firstly act immediately to address the supply shock. That means identifying those businesses which are going to be badly affected, particularly small businesses, and providing support for those businesses in the form of cash or support with credit.
To sum up what he's saying, he says that we should just find a way to stimulate businesses so they're encouraged to continue doing business, and if not, produce more business.
The crisis has brought a new perspective, not just here but around the world, to the impact of the casualisation of the workforce.
Casualisation of the workforce. You're probably thinking to yourself, what the hell does that mean? So if you're a full-time or a part-time worker, what generally happens is when you fall sick or ill, you actually get paid for that sick day, so you don't have to come into work in order to earn money. Now with casuals, they're not guaranteed any hours, and if they do call in sick for a particular job, they do not get paid for that job during the day. Now if this is your only source of income and you fall ill, you'll tend to find that people will still come into work even though they're sick because they cannot afford to miss out a day's worth of wages. So this provides a pretty dangerous environment for the COVID-19 virus to spread, especially if people have to determine whether or not they can go without a day's worth of wages or risk getting people sick. And with our growing number of casual workers in the workforce in the last 20 years, it's only making the problem even worse.
And that means providing things like sick leave during periods of quarantine, ensuring that workers aren't forced to go to work in the event where they might be sick.
It's something governments have not had to contemplate in the past, but when it unveils its plans later this week, the talk will all be about keeping people in jobs and keeping businesses in business.
So there you go. That's the situation that's currently happening in Australia with the COVID-19 crisis. So hopefully you guys have some sort of idea of what you want to do, what policies that we should focus on in order to survive this COVID crisis and make Australia great again.